Welcome everyone to Tuesday, June 5th recording for the Project Jupyter IPython developers call. We're following an agenda on Dropbox paper, and looks like the first item in there that has notes is on Jupyter Lab, and Dropbox isn't showing me who typed that in there. So if whoever typed that in there can speak up, that'd be great.
Yeah, it was me and Jason.
Okay.
So let's see. In the last week, we've merged a lot of things because we were all together. Two big ones that I know about are Grant's JavaScript extension, which is a MIME renderer for JavaScript, and that's been a commonly requested feature. Now, the thing about it is, it may well be the case that JavaScript people wrote still won't work in lab. Like, you might still have to write different JavaScript, but you know, we need some form of this functionality, and now it's in. The other big one is one that Vidar wrote, and it's the notebook attachments. We were not rendering them, and we were losing them when you saved. That is now in master, and that's a big one. That was a feature parity one. Let's see. I've been working for seemingly forever on multiple windows, and some of the fallout from that is refactored theme manager, so that themes show up on the fly, a new way to clone workspaces, because you can't just do everything by changing a URL and assuming things get copied to the default workspace. So now there's a clone URL parameter that does that. And there's some weird edge cases, and I think I finally figured out why things that I thought would work in a predictable way don't, and it's because when you tell JavaScript to set timeout for 100 milliseconds, it hears set timeout for 100 milliseconds-ish. And it could be lower than 100, which is the perverse part. I would have thought the ish meant go over 100, but no, it could actually be under 100 apparently. So anyway, trying to resolve that. And Jason added a line here about, oh, that's right. So his massive widget context refactor is in as well. And that cleans up a lot, and it was just necessary, but a huge effort on his part. And then last week, we all got to talk with Chris about the Phosphor data store. He walked us through its API, how it works, and some of the work from that has been split up. So I believe Ian and Nick are working on a server implementation, and then Chris is still continuing the Phosphor side, and then once that's in a usable state, I think he and I are going to be working on the Jupyter Lab client side use of it. If anyone else wants to say something about Jupyter Lab, now is your moment, because I'm done.
Okay. Sounds like no one's going to take you up on that. So we can move on to services. Peter, that looks like those are your notes.
Yeah, for my part at least, I've been working on getting the documentation site, at least the first version of it, finished up, including the contributor doc for the Docker Stacks project. Jess has been great reviewing when I've asked. Thank you very much. Carol and Chris were helping out too. And if anyone else has comments, the pull request is there. I did create a cookie cutter repo for anyone that wants to follow the same build chain that we use. It has its pros and cons, but members of the community, the goal is members community can set up to build their own Docker images, so that the folks that do want to contribute new Docker files with Cling and Jupyter, or you name it, and Jupyter can go do that in a community maintained repository. instead of us having to continually load them all into the one repository to the point where it becomes really hard to maintain. So we'll see how it goes. At least the documentation's almost all out there now, and we'll see how the community responds and adjusts accordingly.
Okay, great. Thanks, Peter. Min, do you want to talk about Jupyter Hub or anything to add to your release notes?
Not really, just that we've been working on getting the Jupyter release ready to go, and I think it's just about ready to ship probably in the next week or so.
Okay, great. So
one question, Min, can you give us a 30-second highlight of the main things in 0.9?
A number of performance and scaling issues, you know, improving how it handles large numbers of users and things, and then little nice bits like a little progress bar when you're launching instead of a spinner, and kind of more feedback for the users, and then adding some things in the API for building things that kind of use Jupyter as kind of a piece of a deployment like Binder, rather than as a GUI application. Better tools for managing API tokens and stuff like that.
Great.
Mostly not super exciting stuff for actual users, but a lot of deployment help.
okay, so it looks like we've made it through our list of sub-projects and those that had updates. So before we move on to conferences and events, we can now have time to just go or to talk about things that aren't on the rest of the agenda. It looks like we have some updates from Brian on the Jupyter team meeting, which was last week.
Hi, everyone. So yeah, we had a team meeting last week in person at Berkeley, and had, how many people did we have? 22 people there. And I wanted to give an update on a few things sort of on the organizational community side. There was a number of different breakout groups, and throughout a couple of the different days, we had breakout groups related to governance, organization, diversity, and inclusion. And the first breakout group we had, we began to discuss the sort of refactor of the steering council that had originally been started, I guess that was in the fall of 2016 team meeting. And the original idea there was to begin to reimagine two different groups. One, sort of the tentative title is Jupyter Distinguished Contributors. That would be a way of acknowledging contributions to the project. And then a second board or steering council that would be smaller and have a different structure than our current one, with the idea that that would be an active board where there would be some level of ongoing commitment associated with it. And so the discussions we had at this team meeting were basically how to get going on the next steps for that. And we had a very good discussion, and the discussion basically ended with the people who were there, I think it was around 6 people, taking on the responsibility of appointing a working group to continue on with that governance work. The group that was there didn't feel comfortable sort of immediately and directly owning that for themselves, but wanted to go through some process to figure out who are the right people to be involved in that small working group. And the goal of the working group would be to lead a process to figure out where should we end up on all these things. Some of them, there was discussion of bringing in an external management consultant type who specializes in organizational structure questions. And then also we want to make sure that the team that will be appointed has some process for gathering input from the existing steering council, the core contributors, as well as the larger community as well. So that team will be working in the coming weeks to figure out, to appoint the team that will eventually take on that. The second topic that was discussed was the pattern of team management that the Jupyter Hub and Jupyter Lab projects are currently using. And the history on this is originally when the project was sort of first exploring the question of teams. This is back when Jamie was working a lot on this. We had come up with a slightly more formal notion of teams and appointed team leaders, and we've never really done anything with that. But in the meantime, parts of the project have sort of spontaneously formed teams, and the main proposal there is the way that the Jupyter Hub and Jupyter Lab teams are handling this is self-managing a list of team members on a README of an appropriate repo. Jupyter Hub does this on the Team Compass repo. Jupyter Lab does this in the main Jupyter Lab repo. And we're proposing to basically encode that pattern for the project. And it's basically a way for different parts of the project to take responsibility for both managing the team, figuring out who's on the team, but also building a healthy team and working environment. And so the rough way that we're seeing Jupyter Hub and Jupyter Lab working with that is that this is a group of people who are together self-recognizing we're the people who are responsible for this, not just the code, but the community aspects of it. And so the proposal is to submit a pull request to the governance repo describing that model for team formation. Obviously, that would go through any normal review and discussion process on the governance repo. And then the last topic, and the one that we focused on the most, was diversity and inclusion. And there were 3 separate times related to that. The first day, we had an agenda planning session. Well, I guess, what day was that? Tuesday?
Yeah, it was Tuesday.
Yeah, I think that was Tuesday. The goal of that meeting was to get together people who are interested in the topic to help plan the agenda for the larger group activities on Wednesday and Thursday. And there were maybe a dozen people who attended that meeting. And the sort of net result of that, there was a lot of good discussion, a lot of good ideas, and then Fernando, myself, Anna, and Tim were sort of elected and volunteered to sort of finish up the planning. And so on Wednesday, we had an all-hands time on diversity and inclusion, and the goal of that time was to sort of brainstorm an idea generation related to diversity and inclusion. So we broke up the overall group into 5 groups of 4 to 5 people. And then we began by reading a set of slides that Carol had pointed out on diversity and inclusion, sort of as background to get us all thinking about that. And then we, in the small groups, brainstormed on major themes or areas of work that the project needs to tackle related to diversity and inclusion. And then we came back together and the groups all shared. So the individual groups wrote that on sticky notes, their ideas on sticky notes. The groups came back together and read this content of the sticky notes. And then together we all placed the sticky notes on a whiteboard that had a 2-dimensional grid where one of the axes was the difficulty of implementing it, And then the other axis was, is this matter primarily related to individuals or to the community? So the individual things were more related to things where it would involve individuals in the project making changes where we don't necessarily have like a global policy across the project, whereas the community things were more things where there needed to be some sort of structural, organizational, policy level work. Originally the idea was to have another set of activities that follow on those sticky notes. And so at the end of that day, we had everyone put, what do you call it, stickers on the sticky notes that they were most interested in discussing. And the following day, when the four of us met, it quickly became apparent that both the number of sticky notes that were generated was very large. The level of the sticky notes that bubbled to the top, a lot of them were quite challenging, and we felt like it was going to be pretty difficult to tackle those without further planning and work. And we also began to feel like because some of the issues were challenging, it was going to be really important to build trust in the team around these topics. And so we pivoted. I should mention, we have captured all of those sticky notes, both in photos, and I think we've transcribed them. We've transcribed them as well, so we have all that content as well as the positions of the sticky notes in that two-dimensional grid. On Thursday, though, we had a time of all hands open sharing, and the format of that was that everyone had 3 minutes to share their own thoughts, experiences, and ideas related to diversity and inclusion. And the goal was to, again, build trust and provide a safe place for people to share about that. And the way that we did that was through a format called No Crosstalk, where basically everyone gets to share, but when you share, you only share about your own experience and thoughts. You don't comment on other people's thoughts. So it's not really a discussion format. And so sharing was optional, but everyone in the room ended up sharing. And the people that I've talked to, well, first of all, I should say it was a very good time. A lot of people were able to be sort of appropriately vulnerable related to these issues. And the people I've talked to since have said that this was a really helpful time in our goals of building trust and safety to talk about these things. The next steps on diversity and inclusion are that this small group of Fernando, myself, Anna, Tim, is going to continue a process. We don't have a sense of exactly what the next steps are yet. And then M also indicated a desire to be involved in this. So I guess it will be 5 of us who will be moving forward with that process. This team won't be responsible for making decisions, implementing things, etc. It will be along the lines of what we did last week, namely leading the process on behalf of the project. And am I forgetting anything on that? All right, sorry, that was a lot, but it was a busy week and a lot happened, so it's worth updating everyone. And if anyone here or in the broader project has questions about any of these issues, especially diversity and inclusion, please get in touch with any of us that are leading that process, which again is myself, Fernando, Anna, Tim, and M. And I think that's it.
Okay, great. Thanks for that update, Brian. It looks like, Jason, you have a note about a new mailing list. Do you want to share a little bit more about that?
I think it's fairly self-explanatory. Idea is that there's a new mailing list for research facilities. There's a description online. Feel free to look at it and tell your friends about it. If the needs in that description that's online apply to, tell whoever that applies to. We're trying to jumpstart a small community of people that have very focused needs.
Okay. Great, thanks. And just a quick reminder, if you have anything that was released last week or anything planned for this week or anything coming next week, if you can repeat that note at the very bottom of the agenda, that would be great, just so we can document that. And now we'll talk a little bit about conferences and workshops. Actually skipped over JupyterCon. The next thing with JupyterCon is, and something I will start talking a little bit more about on Twitter in the next week, is we have our deadline coming up for the student scholarships on June 16th. So that is, I have a link to the form for applications, and I'm going to start pushing that a little bit so that we get kind of that final round of applications in. So we have our running list of conferences and workshops. Please keep adding to that as you hear about events that may be of interest to the community, or as you start adding to your speaking schedule, let everyone know here. It looks like Sylvan's speaking at an event coming up, but I don't think he's on the call. So does anyone want to talk about any of the events listed in the in our agenda? Looks like we have UV and Carol going to Carpentries Unconference and some folks presenting at SciPy, but is there anything anyone wants to highlight?
I think the one that Sylvan's doing is Pi Londinium on Saturday. I don't know. I don't know if anyone's around, but yeah, I figured I should mention it.
Yeah. Okay. And a couple of calls for proposal. Actually, the Lisa one closed already. The next one that's open, I'm going to take that off the list, but the next one that's open, does anyone know anything about that? It looks like Jessica, you added that note. I'm not sure if you have audio right now.
Sorry, I hear you. What note did I make?
About the open call for proposals for enabling
Oh, yeah.
learning.
So, yeah, I'm working on a reproduce Docker thing. I will discuss it with you all further later. Just keep that on the horizon for now.
Okay. Sounds good. All right, so that's the end of the agenda. Anything, any last minute ideas or comments you want to share before we close out? Okay. All right. Well, it was good to see everyone. I hope you have a good rest of your week.
Yeah.